It's lovely to see everybody. Well done for getting out here on a rainy Thursday night. I don't need to introduce the topic. We all know why we're here. Just the panel briefly. I think you've all probably seen on the website the notes on each of them, but just a reminder. Cathy Sampson was formerly a correspondent in Beijing for the Times newspaper, or at the time of the Tiananmen Square protests and the Beijing massacre. She has gone back and forth from China ever since, and lives and writes now in China as a novelist rather than a journalist, and she's just brought out her third novel, Pool of Unease, which is actually set in Beijing and describes the grittier, seamier side of Beijing that the Olympic authorities don't necessarily want you all to see. Zhang Lifan hails originally formative years in the BBC Chinese service, born and bred in China, and but now a British resident, and he now works for ftchinese.com as an editor and goes to and fro from China
as the editor
all the time. The editor. Thank you, Duncan. Rob Gifford, formerly BBC as well, but now NPR, was for several years the NPR bureau chief in Beijing, and just towards the end of his stint there, he made what is now a legendary journey on Route 312 from Shanghai out to the border of Kazakhstan in the very west of China, 3,000 miles, and he turned that into a fantastic radio series and then subsequently into the book China Road. And Duncan Hewitt, last but not least. Duncan, also former Beijing correspondent for the BBC and Shanghai correspondent for the BBC, now lives and works in Shanghai, writing a lot for Newsweek, and he has brought out an extremely profound and thorough study of social, economic, political change in China called Getting Rich First. So a huge range of experience on this panel, everyone with at least 2 decades of working in or around China as a story, and
more or less.
And so let's get started. And obviously one of the chief topics we wanted to consider was reporting of China, and everyone here with so much experience of it. So let's just start with that as a topic. We've seen a lot of China in the news even over the past month, all the stories about recalling toys, mining safety, collapsing bridges, air quality in Beijing. Jacques Rogge talking about postponing some of the endurance events at the Olympic because of the dreadful air quality. Quite a range and breadth of stories, but are we getting the stories right? Are they the ones that need to be told, and are they being told in the right fashion? Cathy, do you want to begin?
I would say that as journalists, one has to report what there is to report. So the suggestion that one shouldn't report these things seems to me more extraordinary. I do think that it's difficult, incredibly difficult, to get a balance in China, just because it's a vast country, as we all know, but with huge discrepancies between the countryside and the cities, and even city to city, area of countryside to countryside. You can tell a billion different stories in China, and every one of them can be true. But, and I think that foreign journalists are struggling against all sorts of things, not least the lack of information from the Chinese press and from the Chinese authorities. But within those boundaries, I think the fact that news organizations are now paying a lot more attention to China means that they're giving it more space, and the more space you have, the more accurately you're going to report.
Lifan, your experience?
I think my experience, is, I'm one of the only one in the ensemble that have the disadvantage of sitting in London and watching how the China story unfolding. I think, unlike Duncan or Kath and Robert, I think, they very much has been, like herself, has been on the front line. So my experience is that, and as you just mentioned, a serious example of what's happening in China at the moment. For example, like environment issues as well as toy recall story. I think the whole you know, if we compare with 10 years ago, I think the general portrait of China and the reporting of China is more resemble like a real society. You know, and China now is being portrayed and being covered like a real society with real people in it. You know, if we compare with 20 or 30 years ago, at that time, the reporting, especially with the severe restriction of the journalism movement in China, there's a lot of nuances writing. There's a lot of reading between the lines of people's daily. But now, I think for the last couple of years, although some of the restrictions are still in place, but they're not that aggressively enforced, because China is now in the process of being open to the outside world. That tendency is unstoppable. So on the whole, that I think, you know, the topic today sounds like a calling for self-criticism, you know, something Chairman Mao has invented. But I think on the whole, I think, you know, I think the Western media has done the right thing, and also the portrayal of China is become more real in the society, which in the eye of the media is becoming more organic. I think that is the progress.
Okay, well, let's pick up some of those points with Duncan and Rob, who both obviously been working very recently as, and Duncan still is, working as reporters on the front line in China. Duncan, you, Li Fen's point about the restrictions relaxing, giving you more freedom to move and work, is that happening for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the restrictions which were relaxed at the beginning of this year in the run-up to the Olympics, which allow foreign journalists for the first time to travel around China without getting permission in advance from the local authorities in whichever town or province they're going to. I think there's no doubt that foreign journalists find that obviously makes life easier. I mean, in practice, foreign journalists have tended to ignore these restrictions over recent years. I'm not sure I'd be saying that if I was, you know, in China, but you know, basically, there's a sense that the authorities have, I think, realized, you know, on a certain level wisely that if you give the foreign media more freedom up to a point, you're actually going to get more balanced reporting. I mean, that's what I've always felt, that the more controls you impose on the journalists, if they're all sitting in Beijing in some, you know, office in a diplomatic compound and being followed every time they go out of the door, the stories they're going to write are going to be a lot more negative and perhaps a lot more embittered than if they get around and see, you know, all the beautiful aspects of China despite all the problems.
And do you think there's that degree of planning and thinking and maturity going on, or is it just we're a big powerful nation, we don't care, they can say what they like about us?
No, I don't think they ever are going to say in the near future that we don't care what people say about us. I think that on a certain level of government there's an understanding. I mean, you would say it's probably in the foreign ministry and the people that are dealing directly with the foreign journalists, that those people have become a lot more aware of how the Western media works and of how China is portrayed. And I think they, up to a point, they would now say, we know that we're going to get some coverage which is not purely positive, and we understand that and we accept that. If you write continuous negative stories about China as far as they see it, they're still likely to be annoyed and to sort of summon your editor or whatever. But I think that doesn't mean that the rest of the Chinese bureaucracy has changed. And there's been the Foreign Correspondents Club in Beijing did a survey recently of the attitudes of foreign journalists to these changes in the regulations, and there's still plenty of dissatisfaction. But often it's on a local level. That you go to some province and you find that the police there, you know, they haven't received a directive from the foreign ministry in Beijing saying be nice to foreign journalists. And if they've got a big protest going on in some very tense situation, then they're not going to be sort of saying step forward and you know, take your picture over here, please.
On that, Rob, you know, you obviously made that journey step by step, you know, mile by mile. What Duncan says about, you know, people who didn't receive the directives on being nice to foreign journalists, any change of temperature that you've noticed?
Well, I made the journey across China on Route 312 from Shanghai to Kazakhstan and didn't come across a single official. I made the whole journey. In fact, we got stopped once for speeding, but that ended up with a conversation about Yao Ming and David Beckham. So, you know, the policeman, and we sort of managed to talk our way out of it. But we really just, I just really travelled on my own by bus, hitchhiking, taxi, camel, right the way across China without seeking or receiving permission or being blocked by any Chinese officials. So there is this is the amazing thing about China now, there is this space that has been created in China, and I think this is one of the crucial things of the post-Tiananmen situation in China, is that the government has been very smart on one level. They've said, stay out of politics, stay out of anything sensitive, and you can have space, and you can make money. And that applies to foreigners as it does to Chinese people. But of course, there is a limit to that. And certainly, as you say, the local officials don't always get the memos, and as the Chinese expression goes, the strong dragon is no match for the local snake. And the local snakes of regional officialdom in China are very snakish, and they really do not want you to come and tread on their toes and come and... There's one bit in my book where I sneak into this AIDS village where they've all caught AIDS, and we have to do it in the back of a truck, you know, sneak in, not get caught. There's still plenty of bad stuff going on and plenty of stuff they don't want you to see. But on the whole, absolutely, I do agree with Duncan in what he says. My one issue, though, is I think that freedom, there comes a point where China's kind of, hey, we're a big modern country, yeah, we can give journalists freedom, but you start down that road, and obviously that road is leading somewhere, and it's leading somewhere that, in the end, the Chinese government doesn't want it to lead. So you could say, I mean, as you could say about the Chinese economy or Chinese social freedoms, they're actually signing their own death warrant in the end by allowing this to happen, because you know, you give people a taste of it and they're going to want more.
So from what I gather from you two, you're basically saying that in terms of the journalists working inside China, the new directive starting from January the 1st this year relating to coverage in the run-up to the Olympics has not really affected your work.
Well, I think it's made it easier in the sense that you don't necessarily worry so much about being stopped.
Yeah.
And in theory,
because you've got a bit of paper that says you're allowed to be there.
You probably, and a lot of journalists, I think, are carrying those regulations with them, so that when they run into you know, one of these local snakes, they can get it out. But you know, and I have to say, to be fair, China is so diverse, and different places are so different from each other. You can go to plenty of cities and even provinces where the local authorities are quite happy for you to be there. I mean, you may not discuss exactly what you're doing all the time, but there are plenty of stories on serious social issues where they don't mind you doing it. And you know, I've had times this year where I've had to call up local foreign affairs bureaus because I wanted to get an interview with an official on a story. And you know, one should be fair and say that sometimes these people are extremely helpful. You know, we were doing things like urban planning. It's not particularly sensitive, but still it raises various questions. And they do facilitate up to a point. It obviously depends what you're talking about.
And they do, to some degree, realise that they've got a story to tell. I mean, and the classic case was when I went to Tibet a few years ago, about 2003, I think, and I was just amazed. I was on an official delegation with other journalists, with a delegation, and these kind of, you know, reporters' trips, normally you just avoid them like the plague, because in the past the guys would stick to you, that you can't go out of your hotel unless you're with them. And we were in Tibet, you know, surely the most sensitive of all places in China, and you know, you sort of think, oh, well, we'll try this on a little bit, and you just say, oh, I'm just going out for a walk. And the minder goes, okay. And you think, hold on a second, this isn't how the dialogue is supposed to go. I'm just going out for a walk. And he goes, okay. And you just wander into a nightclub and start talking to the young people about the Dalai Lama. And I was just, you know, of course I put that into my report, but also you walk around Tibet and, you know, you can see that they are, the government, I think, as you were saying, is realising, of course there's big issues and very sensitive issues, but not just in Tibet, in the rest of China, they realize that they've got an economic story to tell, and that there are a lot of changes that, you know, are actually quite good. Tibet is probably a bit of a sensitive choice to talk about good or bad, but there is, you know, 400 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China since 1978. I mean, that's the entire population of South America. There's no country that's ever done that before. So I agree, credit where credit is due. You have to report that, and I think the government now realizes that.
I think it's time for a but.
Yeah, go on, sure. There's always a but.
There's always a but. But I think many things are happening at the same time in China, always. And just as I agree completely, there is this extra space for foreign journalists. Many Chinese journalists say that things are tightening for them, it seems like a contradiction. Now, is this some sort of government policy, or is it simply chaotic policy? Is it different groups of people deciding different things for different groups? That's not clear. And the other thing is that as there is this open space growing for foreign journalists, and you see fewer and fewer officials, and you can wave your piece of paper and say, I'm legally allowed to be here. What is happening is that the locality and the snakish officialdom are relying on thugs to beat up the people who speak to foreign journalists. So it's very difficult. I mean, this is an example of how difficult it is to give a view of what's happening in China. Just as one thing seems to be improving, something changes on a different level, which changes the balance and the formula that you're dealing with. And so even if you're able to go into places and talk to people, and even if an official comes along and challenges you, you're allowed to carry on with your interview, you may find that the people who have spoken to you get in great trouble, and much more trouble than you can be in as a foreign journalist. And I think that's something that foreign journalists in China are always having to balance the effect of the importance of getting a story out, which the Chinese journalists simply often are not able to do because of pressures on them, and the dangers of going to talk to people and reporting and talking to people who may not even fully understand the dangers that they're getting into by talking to foreign journalists.
And we've also seen these cases in the last couple of years about involving the Chinese people who work with the foreign media, and you know, it's true, at the same time as the pressure on the foreign journalists themselves is apparently being relaxed, messages have been sent through, you know, the jailing of Qing Chong, or the arrest of people like Zhao Yan, who was a researcher with the New York Times. And so clearly, as a foreign passport holder, you're always in a very privileged position. And it does mean, as with all these things, when the once black and white lines become blurred, you have to make more choices about what you do, and you have to be more aware and more concerned about the impact of you interviewing someone, or the impact of you using a Chinese person as a researcher or a fixer and contacting certain types of people for certain types of interviews.
Are you finding that, Li Feng? Because you're going in and out, and so presumably the picture that you step into changes every time you go back.
Certainly, sometimes I think, most of the time the impression which I got when I departing from either Shanghai airport or Beijing airport is I totally got lost. I think the concept of the space is a very important one. I think there's no doubt that for the last 20 or 30 years, and since the open door reform, I think the civic space is enlarging. I think the amount of freedom for the ordinary Chinese to exercise the decision and the choices over their everyday life is definitely. But I think, at the same time, it also highlighted the issue that there's something fundamental which is still missing. There's a missing link. That is about the decision which is affecting the nation, the governance. For example, like, in the forthcoming the party congress, I think there's a lot of speculations about, the new leadership, who is going to be in and who is going to be out. I think it is on those areas which I think the nature of the Chinese system is being exposed. You know, there's no problem for you to discuss, you know, how many girls which David Beckham has been slept with. You know, you have plenty of freedom to talk about that.
In the media.
In the media.
Or not. Yeah.
Or not. Of course, I think, you know,
Allegedly.
Allegedly. But on the other hand, I think there's something which is more fundamental, which about the direction of the country is going. You know, the accountability of the political leadership. It is on that kind of area which I think China still has a long way to go.
And can you get that across? You know, I mean, in your journal, because we talked about the means of doing the story, but let's come back now to what the story is and how the story is being told. Is that question, those profound questions of governance, are they being addressed in the journalism that is reaching the outside world?
I think yes or no. For example, like I just picked the example that Duncan just mentioned about, you know, the relaxation of foreign journalists to movement since the new year. And I just came back from China. One thing which I've been told is that there's a lots of a debate between the central government and the local government. You know, apparently, you know, this decision for allowing journalists to more or less full freedom to report as they wish has been got a lots of opposition from provincial officials. One example which I was given is that before the new ruling was implemented, precisely any provincial official in charge of propaganda will be locate the movement of any foreign journalist within the region within 60 minutes. But now it will take between 4 or 5 days.
Yep.
If that, if ever.
Yeah.
If ever. But of course we can understand the reason why the government want to actually take such a step. You know, for short term, and it is something to do with the Olympics precisely. On the other hand, I think, you know, a increasingly open economy will have to push for more freedom, including the freedom of the journalists. And also I think the government has become more savvy in terms of dealing with the media. I can tell you that, you know, 10 years ago when I was doing a radio documentary for the BBC, it took me 4 hours trying to actually negotiate my process just to recording the stepping, you know, in the local marriage registration office. Because I was doing a program about a couple who were divorced but recount their life. It is a pretty, you know, light-hearted. Yeah, because I just want to have the sound effect.
Yeah.
It took me 4 hours in negotiating with different level of a district and the Shanghai municipal government officials.
And do you think that's partly, and that's changed, and do you think that's because people now have real journalism in China, even if limited, and therefore they know that that a radio journalist needs the sound effect of a stamp?
I believe so. I believe so.
Can I just pick up on that in terms of the Western coverage? Because talking about, of course, we need this political step. China has not taken this political step, but I think sometimes the danger is in the West that China is seen as a political story still. But in China...
Or just as a problem.
Or as a problem, and of course, big, bad Communist Party, which is in some ways still very big and very bad, but in China you have this...
But not very communist.
But not very communist. But in China you have this completely depoliticized society, as Li Fen's talking about. It's not... You know, you can write... I mean, read Chinese Cosmo. I mean, it's amazing.
Hello Magazine.
Hello Magazine in Chinese, but you can't touch politics. So you can read about David Beckham, you know about Brad and Angelina, you know about all the Chinese equivalents, but there's a something completely missing from the discourse in China. There's no political discourse, and yet in the West, I think, you know, for some obvious reasons, we are sometimes a bit hung up on the political discourse, that we don't realize that the economic and the social nature of the revolution that is actually going on.
But politics is economics and social change. I mean, apart from kind of leadership, high leadership politics, I mean, you know,
I don't think
economics and social change is deeply, deeply political. And what I see in the Chinese press is a kind of anecdotal approach to picking out the experiences of perhaps one or two people. And, I mean, I'm not talking, I have to say, I'm not a great reader of the Shanxi Daily or anything. I'm talking about very, very accessible English language papers. They have little snippets of news, often terrible, terrible stories, especially about medicine and healthcare and education. Often cases
sort of social exclusion.
Social exclusion. People who are dying of various illnesses who cannot afford their medical fees. Now, this has become a staple, it seems to me, of the Chinese press. And it's an effort to, I think, an effort to say something politically, but it's bound, it has to be bound to the anecdote, and therefore you have to still read it, like reading the tea leaves, because you have to put all these stories together and see what people are trying to say. But I think those economic messages and those social messages trickle in this way through individual stories into the Chinese press.
Well, that's the Chinese press. Now, Rob, you were talking as well about, you know, what's appearing here. So you're basically saying that there's still a little bit of an imbalance in the coverage of China, are you?
I'm not sure. I always say it's such a dangerous... this is part of the problem, I think.
Because Kathy's point at the very beginning was that, and Li-Fen echoing it, that there's now so much space for China that you can get a truer, deeper, more detailed picture across.
You can, but I mean, this is such a sort of sensitive subject to discuss as a journalist, because especially in relation to China, no one wants to be seen as a panda hugger, and you don't want to be sort of saying, oh yeah, no, China's all just great, and we're just not getting how great it is. But I'm about to say that. No, I'm not going to say that, because of course we still need to report the human rights stories, as we all have and we all do. But I think there is sometimes a danger, I think still, to have a sort of freak show China reporting, so that it's only really when they're kind of killing babies or cloning pandas or, you know, hey, it's the wacky Chinese, yeah, let's see what they're doing, that China really catches the eye. And so the nuanced daily revolution that is going on in people's lives, which is going on pretty much in the life of every single person in China, their lives are being absolutely convulsed.
For good or bad.
For good and bad. And I'm not saying it's got to be good, it just needs to be more nuanced. It needs to be daily lives, and this is part of the problem. China is a massive documentary story at the moment, but there are no bombs going off, there are no big demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, and the difficulty is gauging and trying to work out how to cover those documentary stories for news, I think.
I mean, I think there's, like Kathy said at the very beginning, I mean, you're making a lot of choices because there are just so many stories, there are so many aspects of this enormous sort of seething transformation that's going on, and you are having to choose, you know, how many human rights problems do you report? How many stories do you report about, you know, people going to IKEA or, you know, sort of doing new things, which they are all the time? And I think that the journalists based in China, the foreign journalists based in China, generally speaking, are quite aware of all this complexity and all this subtlety. Often you do feel that there's a different issue perhaps with the editors back home. And maybe those of us who've worked in China have all experienced, you know, trying to explain certain complexities to the editors of certain programs or whatever. And I mean, you know, sometimes I reduced this to the concept that news editors were only interested in stories about China if they were about pandas or human rights. And I was once told by the editor of a certain radio program operated by a certain media organisation that we're only interested in human rights stories about China. That was quite a few years ago. I mean, I think there's also been certain sort of trends in media coverage of China. I think that it was all pretty negative through the late 90s, and we were in Beijing, and it felt pretty negative, didn't it? It was quite grim. And then I think sort of around 2003 or something, when there was Chinese man in space, or Chinese
9/11 as well. 9/11
well,
was
that helped
crucial.
in the US probably more with their image, because they were on the right side of history for a change.
Because suddenly the new post-Cold War enemy was revealed, and hey, it wasn't China.
Yeah. And also, but also I was here like in, was it 2003 that they had the first, or Ford, the first Grand Prix Formula One in China. And everyone in Shanghai was saying, how come we've wasted so much money on building this Formula One circuit? You know, it's kind of meant to be PR for China or what? A huge investment. But when I was over here and I listened to like 5 Live and the coverage they were getting, and they were getting a lot of people, a lot of journalists who'd gone there for the race, who hadn't been to China before, and everyone was basically saying, wow, it's so modern, it's incredible, you know, they've got all these tall buildings, and, you know, it does help. So I think there's been trends where the coverage of China was very negative, then it got quite positive, and now we're back to some of the old stuff coming back, like with all the food safety and the product safety.
It is quite hard to get the balance right. Are you finding that, Li-Fan?
I find it is interesting. I think both Robert and Duncan mentioned about 2003 or 2002. Suddenly China become a story which is in different kind of a narrative. I've been thinking about that for the last few weeks, because I've been asked to get an answer for that. I find perhaps I think the made in China factor is one of the very important factor. And I think the tipping point was that, you know, if most of the British middle class housewives, they suddenly find, you know, 9 out of 10 toys which they find in Hamleys or in Marks Spencer's, you know, all made in China. Suddenly they realize that something has been happening. So I think that reality, you know, what I mean is a kind of the explosion of cheap but reasonably good quality Chinese goods, and suddenly they were forced to actually make a relationship to a country which is thousands of miles away, you know, which they never visited. You know, all they hear is about either a great war from the picture or kind of a myth to do with Confucius. You suddenly find that there's a country out there which they have to have a relationship with.
I think that means, to some extent, that you have to do away with the old terminology of negative and positive reporting. In a way, that's a cliched way of looking at the whole question of reporting in China, because in a way that's a term which has been largely dictated actually by Beijing. They have called in journalists to complain about negative reporting. I mean, the Foreign Ministry has called in journalists to complain about negative reporting, and we have all somehow been drawn into the same way of, as you say, like a self-criticism, whereas all we should care about as journalists, it seems to me, is accuracy, not whether something is negative or positive. And I think also the terminology of human rights abuses is, again, a very loaded term. Now, what do you call people not being able to afford healthcare because the state healthcare system has completely vanished under their feet? Do you call that human rights abuse? Do you call it one aspect of economic reform, which we would report in Britain, in any other country in the world? You would report both the economic growth and you would report the economic cost and the social cost of these problems. I think to tell ourselves we're being too negative is to tie ourselves in knots to some extent, and I think you're right. China is engaging with the world.
Isn't that partly because China somehow remains such a politicized issue?
Well,
maybe for obvious reasons, but well, I think as anyone who's writing about China will know that you are likely to be criticized from one side or the other. I mean, it's probably more common on China than on a lot of subjects. And I think, you know, going back to the toy story, I think it's quite interesting how the coverage of this, you know, the Mattel story and all this product safety has been really, you know, snowballing in the media, particularly in the US media. I think Rob probably knows more about this. But I was talking to someone who works for a major US newspaper in China the other week, and we were saying, well, you know, there is a fine line between sort of merited criticism and perhaps something slipping over into either just a kind of knee-jerk anti-communism, you know, everything in China is sort of bad at root because of the system, or even occasionally you can't help feeling there's a grain of racism or just some really prejudiced or preconceived attitudes where you just think, wow, you know, the Chinese must be doing something bad, really. But it was interesting that this friend of mine was saying he agreed that a lot of the US media coverage was exaggerated, that it was saying, you know, it was like they'd found certain issues of product safety, which clearly are there and are real. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of very good factories taking all the issues very seriously, and we've all seen them. But my friend said, it is exaggerated, but maybe it's a good thing, because it will force the Chinese government to deal with these problems. And, you know, perhaps that raises another question of, how does foreign media coverage of China impact on China? It is another question.
Well, I think at this point we should get some voices from the floor, because that's quite a lot from the panel. Now, whether you've got questions or whether you've got contributions to make to the discussion, do just fire away. At the back there in the tie. Oh, sorry, could you hold on for the mic? Sorry, I should have pointed that out.
Going back to the Toy Story that everyone's been talking about very recently, do you think that's more of an innate fear that the US had economically in their relationship with China, because the manufacturing base has been eroded, their own economy is slowing down, and all they see is the rampant success China have had relative to the rest of the world at the moment. So it's almost like a strand of media protectionism.
Rob, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, I think there are lots of people in the United States looking for sticks with which to beat China. I think that has been alleviated a bit by 9/11, definitely. And I think the coverage in the United States has become better since 9/11, because it's been sort of shorn of some of the emotionalism that has always, so often anyway, dictated coverage in the United States of China, whether it's the Red Menace or the Yellow Peril or whatever it has been throughout history. So I think there's probably a certain amount of that, but I think there's just some very basic kind of, you know, just a basic realization that that we're also very reliant on China, and so much is coming from China. And hold on, this is toothpaste and cat food, but what about everything else? Maybe there's maybe everything else is badly made, and everything in my house and everything. And so I think there's probably a mixture of both.
Anyone else? Lipan?
I think the Toy Story is in a way that is very symbolic. I think, you know, maybe the Toy Story to some degree, I think if we're looking back, I mean, 50 years later, it is a kind of story which is really define the moment. I think while the cheap Chinese goods has been very much and serving the low-income or even the middle-income West families for 20 years, suddenly they realize that there's something they need to address. I think this is not only going to be issue to be addressed by the West country. This is also should be a issue which I think the local government, the government has to address, because this is a kind of safety issue. Is not only going to affect.
You mean local governments in China?
I think the local government in China. Yeah. But one thing which I find is very interesting, there's one aspect which I think has been overlooked, which is the extremely thin margin, profit margin, which some of the Western supplies which has been imposing on local Chinese producers. I think, we have to put things into perspective. A kind of manufacturers in China at the moment who are producing T-shirts and shoes. 20 years ago, they were farmers. They were peasants working in the rice fields. They were relatively ill-educated. They don't really know what's going on outside China. But they have a kind of instinct which has been guiding the Chinese peasants for generation and generations. They have to make a living. I find this Toy Story is the right kind of story, needs to to be properly debated, I think certainly the government needs to be tightening its regulatory system. But on the other hand, I think the Western manufacturers, including the Western consumers, should also thinking of a fundamental question: what is the price they want to pay for using really cheap Chinese goods?
Yeah.
I think that issue needs to be answered.
And just one footnote to that, I mean, when you talk about Chinese government dealing with the issue, I mean, if you want to see a sudden, oh my goodness, it really is very different over there, look what they did. They shot the head of the quality bureau in Beijing. They took him out and shot him. You know, it's like, no, I mean, deal with it. You don't have to execute the guy who was, I mean, I just found that was kind of, that was a real sort of bucket of cold water for me. It's like, oh, China, yeah, no, they're really kind of, yeah, getting
Well, I
in
think
there.
the thing is they'd arrested that guy long before.
Had they?
But
Okay.
it seems convenient to have
The
him
right
received.
time.
I mean, he was accused of having approved a whole lot of dangerous medicines as head of the Medicine and Food Safety Bureau. I mean, I'm not saying that means he should have got executed, but a lot of people in China felt that it was, you know, an eye for an eye, that he had led to the deaths of people.
Right, right. Okay, I didn't follow it that closely.
Let's take a question from down here with the glasses, yes, and the blue shirt, Rob. The mic's just coming.
I wonder, I mean, this is in a way a follow-on from what you were saying about executions. With the Olympics next year, with the influx of thousands of journalists, international journalists, I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about what kind of controls or ways that China is planning to host the international press pack that's going to descend, really with very poor Chinese language skills and reliant on interpreters, what have you. And what you think that's going to have, whether they're going to be complete stay of executions, or Tiananmen demonstrations going to be allowed next June. I'm wondering what you think is going to happen with the spotlight so clearly on China next year.
Well, Duncan, seeing as you're the one who's working day to day in China, why don't you tackle that?
I don't work every day. Yeah. I mean, I think that, well, there are certain things like executions. It's so hard anyway to get the actual number of figures in any year in China, and all the estimates are just that, you know, estimates. But and so I don't see that will be in any particular way affected, because you don't know when another one's happened in some remote province far from Beijing. I mean, I think that clearly they're going to be concerned about journalists sort of rampaging around Beijing, you know, trying to talk to every dissident or whatever, you know, because some people clearly will want to do this just to test these regulations. You know, there is a debate about the regulations. I mean, as you were mentioning, and I discovered this when I went to get my visa renewed at one point, and the local officials, the police officials in Shanghai were saying, I think you should read these regulations carefully. They say that there's complete freedom to report anything as long as it's related to the Olympics. You know, and it's, what does that involve? But I think that, you know, they, as you were all saying, as Kathy was saying, clearly there are ways and means of encouraging sensitive individuals not to talk to the foreign media, you know, even if the foreign media, in theory, are at liberty to go and ask them for an interview. And these rules say specifically, you can talk to anyone you like, as long as they accept, you know, to be interviewed. And if somebody may have said to them that we suggest you don't accept to be interviewed, then that may happen. But nevertheless, I mean, we've seen interviews with people this year that we might not have seen last year. There will probably be more of it. But I think that clearly a lot of the journalists who go will be there for the sport and the, you know, the beautiful stadiums and, you know, the smog-free environment and so on. Sorry.
Yes, down in front.
Going back to the point that was just made about the price the West is willing to pay for cheap goods, do you think there's any deliberate avoidance of reporting on companies like Walmart and their corporate policies in the West and emphasizing the Chinese side of the story more?
I think from what we, you know, what we read and what we observe in China, I think certainly there's, I think the corporate governance is a big issue in China. There's no doubt about it. If you visit Canton in Dongguan, where is a huge a group of Chinese manufacturers will gather, I think, you will find a lot of evidence that, sweatshop practice, I think, workers were forced to working very long hours at a very minimum pay. I think there's no doubt, I think the local manufacturers and the government, I think, need to tightening their control. And one thing that there's another side of the other aspect, which I also think, just like on environment issues, I think, the Western manufacturers, the Western government should actually using their power. Obviously China wants to have business from outside world, and also, the phenomenal growth of the Chinese economy for the last 30 years, had very much fueled by the export. The export does have a very, 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 very important impact on how the Chinese economy will be going.
But just to interrupt for a moment, Li-Fen, your question was more whether Western journalism is subverted by Western corporate interests, was it?
Oh, sorry, I think I don't know. I don't know.
Anyone else?
Well,
I'm just thinking.
Well, clearly there's plenty of journalism about individual cases where Western companies, there's often the kind of shock sort of whichever high street brand or high street fashion chain is, paying workers tiny amounts in whichever country, and not only China, in somewhere else, maybe in Asia, for example. But I think, there was this interesting issue recently this year with the debate over China's proposed new labour law, right? Has it been passed? It's been, the draft is ready, isn't it? And there were stories that, Western chambers of commerce, without mentioning any countries, were lobbying in their home countries, for their governments to encourage the Chinese government to dilute this new labour law, which actually gave workers greater rights in some fields, to demand higher wages, to be unionised, even though it's only the official government union. I think you probably know more about this than me, Li-Fen. But it was a very interesting case where suddenly it was like the boot was on the other foot, and there clearly were some Western interests which were arguing in favour of less protection for Chinese workers because of their own self-interest. Do you know much about this? I
heard about that.
It's a very sort of intriguing story.
Yeah.
and yet was the story adequately covered by Western news organisations? I suppose is
well, I think in Shanghai, the Foreign Correspondents Club, which I'm involved in, had a debate on this, and so I think a number of the journalists talked. There was one Chinese academic who'd actually been going to Washington and lobbying, I don't know who, but lobbying politicians, I think, among others, to try and explain to them that this actually is not a bad law.
Yeah.
And there are cases where some Chinese laws clearly are, relative to what's gone before, are positive. But again, this is another of those issues that we could talk about for a long time.
Yeah. Let's take another question. On that side, yeah, in the blue T-shirt.
Hiya. I was just wondering about the Chinese environment. Maybe you could give some impressions to how bad, how smelly it is there.
Okay, who was in Beijing yesterday? Who's been in Beijing since the 4-day?
I know, I haven't, people have been here more recently than I am. I'll just give you my 2 pence worth. I'm very pessimistic about the whole environment. It's very bad. And the reason I'm pessimistic is really because is an important point to throw into the conversation, because everything in China depends on the economy. Everything. There's no ideological legitimacy anymore. No one believes in communism. There's an increasing nationalistic legitimacy for the government. They're presenting themselves as the sort of great champions of the great Chinese race and the re-emergence of the Chinese. But essentially, the vast part of their legitimacy is economic. So if you're a local snake, a local official, and you've got a polluting factory, and there are thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of them throughout China, and now further inland as well, and you've got the choice of closing down that factory or doing something about it, as needs to be done in order to really save the ozone or just deal with the environmental issues, or to not shut it down, there's no question. You have to. The Chinese government has to keep peddling. They need to create 23 million jobs, new jobs every year, just to absorb the people coming in from the countryside. They can't afford to close down that factory and have 200 people out of work banging on their door and causing problems. So I think the environment is going to be one of the crucial...
Unless it's the Capital Iron and Steel Works, which is being moved out of the way for the Olympics.
Right, right. So, but then again, that's a sort of showcase place. You don't have to go very far out of Beijing to find the pollution is really not being dealt with, and really can't be dealt with, because they just got to keep that double-digit growth going. Otherwise, you know, they've already got 80,000 cases of rural unrest every year going on, and there could be a lot more if they impose some of these environmental changes that are really needed. I don't know if people are less pessimistic.
No, I'm not at all less pessimistic. I'm heading back to Beijing on Sunday, and I have to say that as one lands in Beijing, in the smog, it's a terribly depressing thing, actually. I mean, I've lived in Beijing this time for 6 years, and it is getting worse, noticeably, month by month worse. And I think it's quite apart. I mean, I could wax lyrical on the subject of smog for hours. I mean, you simply can't see the sky, you can't see the shape of a cloud. You have in the summer, or the hills, you often can't see the house rather closer to you than the hills. And you have, in the summer, 40-degree heat and a grey blanket of smog covering the city. But I think it's a very interesting thing from the point of view of news coverage as well, because you know, I became very frustrated in Beijing, living in Beijing, because people tended to talk to me about it being a foggy day. And I would sort of explode and say, this isn't fog, this is pollution, this is dirt in the air. And because it wasn't part of the debate in China, and because the newspapers didn't discuss pollution, and because, honestly, also people don't really want to think about that they're breathing dirt, and they would rather, in this case, not think about it too deeply. Therefore, there was a kind of mass delusion that this was fog, not smog. And until there was, I think a few months ago, an official directive that there would be a new word, and haze was to be introduced into the vocabulary. And it has since been discussed by the newspapers. Haze. My tones are hopeless. But it's my, or is it my? My. I think it's my. Is it my? Yeah, second tone my. And that's it's a whole new vocabulary which is introduced kind of in a very low-level way, a new debate. And
a haze debate.
A haze debate. And now you do get people talking a bit about pollution. Just create a new word.
Suddenly we've discovered all this haze.
But you know, from someone who living in it, there is very simple things like, for instance, the pollution is often of a level which, grade 5 pollution, in most countries in the world, you would be told that elderly people and children should stay indoors or not go out to exercise. The schools in Beijing have a huge problem. The Chinese schools aren't, I don't think, even aware of it. I've asked Chinese friends, and there's never any directive that children should be kept in. The international schools attempt to live by this, but can't get any real-time pollution monitoring information. Therefore, you don't know. They have no way of acting as they properly should with the children in their care. But to step back from that a step, it means that you have also, as a foreign journalist, very little concrete information to work with. And even often what there is, you can't rely on. I mean, you know, you can see a picture I've seen a quote from the Chinese Environment Agency saying there was, I can't remember what it was. There was no smog in March, or there was no haze in March, and alongside a satellite picture from NASA of a great wodge of smog covering Beijing. And that, you know, when you talk about negative and positive reporting and realistic reporting and accurate reporting, you know, it's not a matter of whether you want to be inaccurate or anything, but how do you, it's very difficult to actually get the facts to write the accurate story.
Yeah. Can I just quickly say, I was once in the office of a Beijing municipal environmental official, and it was one of those horrible sort of whiteout days. It was in December or November or something. And we said, so, you know, visibility is not too great today, is it? And he said, I think this is a medium visibility day. But I mean, I think at the same time it is generally accepted that there are people within the official environmental organizations and the State Environmental Protection Agency who are pretty, you know, they do understand these issues, they do care about them, and they would love to seriously do something about them. It's just, can they do it? And as Rob says, can they compete with all the economic interests?
Yeah. Is there anyone in the room who is optimistic about China's environmental future? It would be quite interesting to hear. Yeah. You're optimistic? You are. Let's hear why.
I'd like to bring together the idea of that the central government is quite smart about opening China up to foreign journalists. I think that's connected to the central-local debate. There's a huge accountability gap. How do you promote local officials? How do you evaluate them? And the central government uses economic indicators. So you look at the green GDP debate between the statistics department and the EPA, and the local government was saying, well, we can't agree on the figures. You can't put a price on a tree. We have to be evaluated on an economic basis. And so you have the central government saying, we want rule of law. We are very concerned about the economic effects of pollution. All the studies say, you know, China needs to act now, or you'll see double-digit effects of pollution on GDP. So you combine that with a growing youth movement. You have a generation of people who've grown up with a relative abundance of material possessions, and they're looking beyond that. They're saying, my air is dirty. What do? I just graduated from university. And they volunteer. And going back to maybe why the central government has opened China up to journalism, Western freedom for Western journalism, I think it's sort of a mechanism for making Western corporations more responsible for the pollution that we've sort of sold to China. You look at like the Pearl River Delta, there was a study that said upwards of 40% of the pollution there is directly related to Western corporations and Western consumption. So sort of bringing those stories to light kind of makes us responsible in a way for the environment in China.
So,
well, can I just say, I think you do raise a very valid point, which is about the level of social concern and the level of kind of activism among the younger generation in particular. And I personally think that this whole concept of the sort of elements of a civil society coming together in China is one of the parts of the China story which is perhaps the hardest to tell and sometimes the hardest to get editors or whoever to be interested in. And certainly the environment is an area where there's been more concern and more activism. At the same time, there have been plenty of cases of activists who got too active, getting, you know, knocked on the head in various different ways, not literally perhaps, sometimes. But I do think that it's very relevant to understand that there is a lot of concern about that. I don't necessarily agree that all the young people who've grown up with a sort of better material situation give two hoots about the environment. But I think the people who see the pollution and feel it every day, I mean, for me, it may be people who go abroad are more aware, because when I come to London now, I think, God, the skies are so blue. Not today, but in general. And I never did before.
Yeah, I think environment issue is definitely one of the issues that I very much see the emerging grassroots NGO environment campaign, I think, as a kind of new expression of the Chinese human rights.
Thousands of grassroots.
I think that it is, but on the other hand, there's two issues. One is that the awareness of a Chinese environment problem is very much on the increase, both at the grassroots level as well as a government level. But the problem is about the implementation. And we all know that, the national department in charge of, environment protection, has been basically, in a very weak position to implement some of the laws and the rulings which has been passed by the Congress. So I think, very recently the FT reported one scoop story about it was under the pressure of the Chinese government, they demanding the World Bank to remove one key statistics from a recent report. That statistic says that they're confident from the scientific evidence that over 700,000 Chinese people will be basically the air pollution and the water quality will be causing the premature deaths of over 700,000 Chinese people per year. But it was under the pressure of the government that key statistic was removed from that report. The government citing that kind of statistic will lead to social unrest.
But do you know pressure from which part of the government, not from the...
It is from
the environmental protection?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I think it highlighted the fact that, on the one hand, they are the government actually responsible for protecting and implementing. On the other hand, within the current structure, they are not actually in that position to make anything real happening. So rather than be facing with more pressure, they resort to the less option.
Cover up.
Yeah.
Cover up.
Yeah.
So that is what's happening.
At the back there, yeah. Can we get a mic up there?
I have a question relating to the Olympics. Given China's history of opening up occasionally and then later on turning in, a pattern that predates communism by many centuries, do you feel that after the Olympics there will be another turning in and maybe a shutting off of the tap when it comes to journalistic freedoms? And if that's something that there may be elements within the government who might want to try that, do you think that they could succeed, or will they be confronted with a sort of a glasnost kind of brush fire, freedoms offered and then very difficult to then contain?
Kathy, do you want to tackle that first?
Well, I was going to say when the earlier Olympics question came up that I think whatever we say at this point is all guesswork, but I think the situation in the next year is going to be very unpredictable and fascinating, because they are playing with fire by having so many journalists come into the country, and I think the government themselves don't really know how they're going to cope with it, and they don't really know what kind of stories are going to come out from the Olympics. And if you look at recent reports and the concentration on the environment, and I mean, recently we had, just this week, we had the WHO saying that people with heart conditions shouldn't even go and spectate during the Olympics because of the danger from the air. I think there is we simply don't know what's going to happen or how the Chinese are going to react, and there may be a certain defensive and angry response if reports are what they describe as negative.
Well,
I think I want to focus on the turning in bit of your question. I think actually the Olympics will go off fine. There'll be plenty of chat and everything, but I think you've put your finger on a very important, bigger question. I think the next decade after the Olympics is the issue, because I think a lot of issues have been put on hold until after the Olympics. September 2008 onwards for the next 10 years, that's the issue. I think China's probably gone too far in engaging with the world to turn inwards completely, and I mean, you haven't really. I think this is the crunch that's coming. I mean, you don't actually have ultra conservatives, for instance, like the ones who are still alive in 1989, but you do have everybody still desperately wanting stability. But my sort of take on this is actually rather a historical one. That is, can China be open? Can it actually, as a country, can it function as the imperial state that it still essentially is, and be open to the outside world? And I think basically that's the crunch that's coming, because after the Olympics, and especially after the 18th Party Congress in 2012, when Hu Jintao will step down and the new generation of leaders will come on the scene, just at the same time as all the rural grassroots problems have increased and all the other issues, and the middle class, the 300 million new middle class, will be 500 million, and they'll be starting maybe to demand things. I kind of think there's a sort of inexorable move towards surely more openness, but yet I don't think the Chinese political system can cope with that, and I'm a bit pessimistic about when the crunch comes, because you know, China is it going to make that? It's the big question. Can it make that transition to something else politically? I don't think it can turn inside. It's gone too far, but yet I don't think it can fully open out and become something different. So short to medium term, I think it can carry on a bit as it is, but I'm slightly worried that when that crunch comes, China's not going to be able to make the transition. That's a slightly bigger picture answer to your question, perhaps. But
I mean, just pursuing that thought for a moment. So it doesn't make the transition, but it can't go backwards. So what then? I mean, you've got it. You're allowed 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute. I really don't know. I'm really quite worried. Because they need to be building the new pillars of the new political house now. Because throughout Chinese history, the end of the dynasty has always been the collapse. 1912, quite by coincidence, is coming up for its 100th anniversary. Hey, hooray! We've overthrown the emperor! Hooray! Oh dear, we just forgot to build any institutions that could run the country. You know, so I just think that they need to be doing it pretty fast. And otherwise I fear that something could come out of left field, like some economic crisis, like something that could really shatter things, and they won't be ready.
Li Fan, this comes back, doesn't it, to your question that you were talking about earlier about one of the big stories that's not really adequately covered. This is this very subtle, difficult, nebulous question of what the hell is going to happen and whether they're putting up the pillars that Rob's talking about now. Do you see any sign that they are?
I think prediction about what's going on in China is very difficult. I think China watching is always a dangerous business. But I think, you know, on the Olympic issue, I think I want to sort of say two things. One is a matter of calculation. The other is a matter of confidence. You know, if the new ruling is specifically targeted Olympic reporting or Olympic coverage, there's no reason why the policy has to be implemented 18 months before the Olympic actually due to start.
I don't think it is.
So I think it is a way by which I think, you know, in a way that I find this new ruling maybe in the new media field is a kind of a little open policy, or open door policy with a small O. I think, you know, when such policy is in place, being implemented or being practiced, I think it will be very difficult to totally shut the door again. I do agree with that, you know, and specific circumstances, if there's something drastic goes wrong, of course, I think, you know, I think Chinese government, the way the Chinese has been developing has always been followed that pattern. Sometimes I think one step forward and two step back. But what I sort of try to convince myself as a journalist is that if they want to put that policy in place, probably they want to maintain and they want to make sure such policy will actually live beyond 2008 Olympics. It doesn't rule out that there will be some twists and turns, but I think the overall tendency is basically unreversible.
Irreversible, Duncan?
Well, I think that a lot of the foreign journalists feel that these slight relaxation of regulations on foreign reporters in China is quite likely to continue. I mean, I don't think nobody can be sure.
Exactly.
But I think clearly there are two different things going on, and one is how, you know, the Chinese media for domestic consumption develops, and, you know, ultimately in many ways that's much more important for China and to the Chinese government. I think they have become aware that foreign media maybe is less relevant, and they have become more comfortable, shall we say, in dealing with the foreign media in terms of what access people in China have to it, and they certainly become more subtle in terms of what they block and what they allow in, and you know this because your website is usually not blocked, although I gather occasionally. So, you know, there's a lot more management that's now directed at the Chinese media, and I personally think that the Chinese media, just going back to our original topic, is a particularly fascinating area because it's much less black and white than it used to be, and there are very interesting things in the Chinese media, and there are all kinds of different pressures and sort of interest groups using it, but often using it up to a point when they find that they've gone too far and somebody gets stamped on. But that doesn't mean it dies out completely. And one thing that struck me, because I wrote a bit about the media in my book, was that you know, in the West we tend to hear the headlines about Chinese government restriction of the media, which are all real, but it doesn't mean that there aren't undercurrents of development that continue. You know, each time an editor gets sacked or arrested, that doesn't mean that every other editor just stops dead. I mean, some of them will be thinking a bit more carefully for a few months, there's no doubt. But the development continues, I think, without a question, in many directions.
And if I could just briefly add, I think the internet is something which has had a far more profound effect and will continue to have a far more profound effect in China than it has anywhere else in the world. If you can imagine, people blog here, and it's a luxury, it's fun, it doesn't mean anything political. There, it's a form of connection between like-minded people, discussion of the issues which go to make up civil society.
Even if it's not overtly political.
Even if it's not overtly, no. Yeah. But these, I think, and that is really that is unstoppable, really, and in a way, China is again going to surprise us all by, I think, developments coming from that kind of field, and changing the face of Chinese media in a kind of guerrilla warfare way.
Because every time there's a clampdown on some aspect of the Chinese media, I mean, there can only be a clampdown because these people have gone too far, and they can only go too far because they are still pushing.
Yeah.
It's worth just throwing in the nationalist element into this as well, though. I think there's a danger of thinking that there's a lot of people in China who are really wanting to sort of oppose the government and use the media and the internet to oppose the government. The people who are on the internet are the winners. I will never forget doing this interview with this guy who, and saying to him, so would you ever use the internet to kind of mobilize or anything like that? And he said, not only would I not do that, I'd report anyone who I thought was doing it. He said, the fact that I have a computer is down to the excellent policies of the Communist Party. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the co-opting of the co-opting of the middle class in the cities who have benefited from, of course, there are many people who are pushing the boundaries and want to push the boundaries, but the really angry people, I think, are not on the internet. And it's one of the big questions is whether those middle-class people who've been co-opted and who are actually, of course they're blogging and of course they're making indirect political points, but they're actually relatively happy with the status quo, and because they've benefited so much from it. It's whether the government can keep those people on board over the next decade so they don't become like the middle class of Taiwan or South Korea and start saying, hold on a second, we need some political reform here.
But you are seeing those kind of interest groups in things, for example, like property and, you know, the disputes over the management of these new luxury residential compounds, or, you know, not necessarily particularly luxurious, but everybody's moving into these new housing estates which are run by companies which are often very well connected. And often there are clashes, and then the residents organise a committee to say, you know, we want to park our car here, or we don't want you allowing people to drill in the middle of the night, or whatever. And these have led to some quite serious clashes, and there are certainly plenty of Chinese academics, I'm sure Li Fen would know about this more than me, but who feel that this kind of, you know, very sort of basic capitalist personal self-interest in property that you own and the rights that some people think it gives them is potentially quite a major political force. And the passing of the property law, which went through this year, was delayed for a very long time, partly because of, apparently, of those kind of concerns.
The stakeholder democracy.
Can I just add to very briefly? I think one thing which I find interesting is that I think a kind of a China exceptionalism, which used to be very popular, I think, you know, among Chinese academics or even in the West, you know, China watchers or journalists. I think, you know, it becomes increasingly less valid. You know, I think, you know, China has now entered into a period that where it has to confront some of the problem which any other society has already experienced or has been struggling to find a solution with. So I think one thing which I find is very important is sometimes we tend to sort of over-interpret some of the policy which has been implemented by the Chinese government. I think, you know, as a Chinese myself, as a journalist myself, I find the decision-making of the Chinese government in the last 20 years or 25 years has been very much reactive. If there's a problem, they want to find a solution to it. And most times, you know, it may be a short-term solution. For example, like an Olympic policy. You know, they have to honor the pledge to the Olympic Committee, allow certain freedom of reporting. On the other hand, it is a matter of confidence building. You know, I think, you know, from now onwards, in the run-up to the Olympic game, is very much a kind of a 12-month drill.
Period.
You know, where the authority can actually assess, you know, whether they can actually cope with the large influx of the foreign journalists. You know, if there's something happened, how they're going to deal with it. So by the time of the Olympic opening, they will say, okay, all right, you know, this policy we can actually handle it, we can cope with it. If they can't handle and cope with it, they will try to find a way either to make some restrictions after the game or carry on as it is. We don't really know, but certainly this is one of their major intentions.
Yeah. Down here. We've got a mic still. Just a couple more questions, this one and then one more, I think. Yes, sorry, in the green shirt.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, how far does the nature of what you're allowed to do as journalists affect your journalistic procedures? For example, Kathy, you said that there's a tendency towards anecdotal reporting, whereas in this country, of course, if someone had couldn't get treatment for a health problem, you as a journalist would go to their health authority or to the Department of Health. Is that channel available to you as a journalist? And secondly to that, how is the sort of the PR machinery working in China now? Is it still very much blanket propaganda, or is it more nuanced, more subtle, and becoming more of a sort of public relations affair?
Who would like to tackle that?
Well, I'm not really working as a journalist, so therefore I think Duncan should answer.
But your point earlier was more about the Chinese media, wasn't it? About what they said about those kind of social problems, that they would use a more anecdotal... They wouldn't extrapolate, you know, to say what is the cause of this.
But I do think it's also something that the foreign media has no alternative but to do is also to use, an anecdote is the wrong word perhaps, but it's not hearsay, but it's an individual case.
Personal stories.
As personal story to discuss a problem, because my understanding is that bigger picture information is still extremely hard to come by. I don't know if you would...
But also on a company or on a department-by-department basis. You know, here there's an issue with a hospital, you go to the media office of the hospital, could you put up someone to answer this complaint? Yes, here's the person, and you get the interview. I mean, it just doesn't happen in China. And so I mean, it's bad. You get to the point where you just think, you're tempted to think, I'm just not going to bother. You know, because
it depends on the issue. I mean, there are times now where you can get government officials in different departments to talk to you. I think much less so in Beijing, and clearly, in general, less so in the central government. You know, if you want to interview a central government official, you're much better off going to some conference which they're taking part in than just grabbing them, rather than going through endless levels of bureaucracy applying. But if you're in, for example, Shanghai, which may not be the best example, but if you want to get an interview with someone from a different government bureau in Shanghai, it's usually not that hard. You know, the Religious Affairs Bureau, the people in charge of social welfare. I mean, if you say to them, I want to interview you about this particular crisis last week, they'll probably tell you to go away. But if you say, we want to talk about your general policies...
Big picture, they'll do.
But then you can still ask them the question.
Right.
And I have to say, I do find that sometimes officials are more open than you might expect, you know, up to a point. And also, I think on these kind of medical problems, I mean, you do now get government officials at the National People's Congress every year coming out with some surprisingly strong statements and saying, you know, actually our medical reforms have been a failure, as I believe the health minister said, you know, in public to the foreign media as well as the Chinese media.
And when you're writing any journalistic story in any other country, or let's just say in Britain, you would be using quotes from two different points of view to balance your story. And in China, it's simply often very difficult to get the non-governmental point of view. So you are left with a governmental point of view and what you can see with your own eyes, which is obviously limited. And I don't think, and I think that may sometimes lay people open to the claim that you are being subjective, that you're, you know, that you're not having the proper objective stand. But how you can achieve that when you cannot have access to the other voice, I think is very difficult.
Because there's not like an organisation of angry patients you can ring up.
Yes. If you're lucky, you'll run into one in the corridor, and you'll report what he says.
There are actually these sort of people around these days, but they probably won't talk to the media.
Right.
Let's take just one last question. Red jersey, just down there.
I was wondering to what extent you think the Western leadership's lack of sophistication in thinking about China restricts your reporting and maybe keeps it cliched?
You mean the Western media, as in the bosses, the editors that one's working for?
The readership.
Oh, the readership. Oh, sorry.
Readership.
The
I think
readership.
the editors would probably respond to what they thought the readership wanted.
Okay. Sorry, I just misheard. Well, who's got readers
Who
here?
works for a media organisation with an unsophisticated readership? Not you, anyway.
Not that I put the Great Wall and the Dragon and Chairman Mao in every article that I write, but no, you certainly, I suppose you have to frame things in a certain way, because there's lots of people who don't know anything about China. It's like I don't know anything about Latin America, but I don't know, why don't they know anything? Because we haven't informed them well enough. I think there's a sort of I guess that's what I'm saying, pushing for a more nuanced reporting of the complexities. It's hard to break the old stereotypes. You know, I had a relative came and visited me in China and got off the plane. She said, "Wow, they got cars." and you're just thinking, where do I start with this? You know,
4 million a year. Yeah.
But I couldn't really. I don't know. I can't sort of.
And I think again, I think some of the terminology that is so entrenched in people's minds is a problem again, because, you know, this model of communism, which is actually capitalism, is very hard for people to get their heads around. And I don't think that's because people are stupid or anything else. I think it's just because people see countries and modes of government in certain models, and China breaks every one of those models, and therefore,
while at the same time pretending that it isn't,
right,
which doesn't help.
Which doesn't help, and therefore you may even find that when you do get your interview with the people you want to speak to, they're talking in terms which need a whole lot of explaining so that they can be accessible to Western readers.
Duncan?
I think I just said what I thought. Yeah, I mean, I think that, I know what, like we've been saying from the beginning, there are lots of challenges for the Western media in making things comprehensible and in getting some of the complexity. And I think that the bottom line is that China is a complex and a contradictory society. A lot of things maybe don't seem to add up, but maybe we have to get used to thinking of it as a new kind of political, I won't say model, but it's not necessarily that they planned it like this, but the result of the reforms have produced this curious hybrid. And I think that it requires kind of imagination to try and put across exactly what's going on, and it's difficult because.
But I think your question. I agree with you, and I think you're being rather polite to your, to your readers and your viewers and your listeners, because I think there is a problem personally with an audience, and that China is a very different place, and it's a very ancient society, and it's got a lot that's very different about it that people just, it's going to be very hard for people to get up to speed with. And they live with Israel-Palestine, they live with US politics day in, day out, and they have done ever since they were born in this country. And they've never had to think hard about, China, the context of China, geographically, socially, economically. And it's, in broadcast journalism, particularly television actually, is worse than radio. It's really, really tough to get that story told well. And it comes back actually to what Kathy was saying, I think, earlier about those personal stories, because quite apart from the issues of the objectivity and subjectivity questions of telling personal stories, if you're going to make a television story about China, you have to have the characters to carry it. It's really the only way to get almost any story across, and to try and tell a tough, rather abstract political or economic story, you can pretty much forget it, because even if you've got a very well-meaning editor who'll put it on air, it will go straight over people's heads, or they definitely won't want to watch it again. I just don't think this audience is ready yet to deal with China quite at that level.
But having said that, I think you should be confused about China. If you're not confused, then you haven't been paying attention.
Yes.
You should be confused. I think it's a progression to be confused. I think if you're not confused, you're still thinking in the old ways, because it is supremely confusing. And
didn't Confucius say something like that?
I'm sure.
And nobody on this panel knows what they're talking about. And then we're going to have to end it, I'm afraid, because we were supposed to be finished by 9. But just a reminder that Duncan's book, Rob's book, and Kathy's book are all on sale, and there's drinks at the back of the room. And
also, I need to work harder.
You need to write a book. But you've been a fantastic audience, and thank you very much to this great panel.